Hi, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Is it hot enough for you guys? That humid, hot heat? Yeah. That's why we live in Colorado, so we don't have to put up with like southern heat, but here it is this time. Anyway, so glad to see you, and I'm so glad you took out the time to find out more about this experience, which actually, if you haven't had a near-death experience yourself, it does impact all of us. Because interestingly, at this time in our history, there seems to be more and more near-death experiencers coming forward and speaking about their experience. It's not lessening, it's increasing. It's almost as if God has activated these people. And they're writing books, and they're being interviewed on Oprah, and some of their books are becoming bestsellers. And of course, meetups are being started where near-death experiencers can share their stories, support each other, and educate the rest of us who have not had a near-death experience. Me, myself, I've not had a near-death experience because I have enough weird stuff that happens to me. I don't need that also. Huh? Now, the near-death experience has been studied for decades. There are PhD white papers on this experience. And as Susan mentioned, Raymond Moody began this back in the 70s and 80s. In fact, there is a research organization called New Heaven, New Earth, just down the street from us, so to speak, in Sedona, Arizona, that does nothing but research this information, and they put together documentary educational videos, which you can watch in the comfort of your own home online, where multiple near-death experiencers talk about their death. And there is a common theme that runs through all of them. It's not that it is a brain chemistry snafu. That has been well discounted many times. If you read Eben Alexander, physician, neurologist, he had a near-death experience. He absolutely did not believe in the near-death experience. Couldn't happen, not possible. Then he died. And he has all the technology and the physiology that proves it, because the brain is not part of our spirit. It is the vehicle for it. So these near-death experiencers, they do bring amazing information back to us. And interestingly, once they do return back here to their physical body, whether they were murdered or they died or had some kind of accident, one foot remains on the other side, and the other foot returns back here to their physical body. So they continue to straddle two worlds for the rest of their lives. That's why they're still in contact with all that unusual, paranormal information, and they have ready access to it. Once they do return to this physical life, their entire life changes. Their career changes. Their relationships change. Oftentimes they get divorced. They move. Their entire life takes a different trajectory. It's quite amazing. And they are on a new path. Now, it's also not unusual. If a person has died once, they may die a second time, a third time, and sometimes a fourth time. If you're familiar with Danny and Brinkley, there's a movie made about his death. In the 90s.
Transformed by the Light.
Yes, Saved by the Light. He wrote that book, and then there was a movie made about his death. He's died 4 or 5 times now. He's not afraid to die. That's something else about someone who's died, is sometimes they're sent back, and sometimes they choose to come back. But in every case, all of them rather stay on the other side. They don't want to come back here. It's tough. It's tough here. They don't want to come back, even if they have infant children to raise and feed. They don't even want to come back here, even if they are married to the love of their life. They don't want to come back here. So you can imagine that when they do finally come back into a broken body or a diseased body, what have you, they have a tremendous amount of guilt because they didn't want to come back to their loved ones. But they get over it, so it's hard coming back. But when they do come back, they come back with skills and psychic abilities that they never had before. And they are awesome, these abilities, for use by the rest of us. Those tools are for us to use to help us. And that really is their entire theme, by and large, when they do return. It's to help the rest of us, because they're bringing the other side, that godness, that love, back here into the physical world, to help us, to remind us on our spiritual path, and to help us make better lives for ourselves and our loved ones. So it's really a loving service. And that's why it's a hard job. So let me introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Lori Neal. She died 3 times before the age of 21. Sometimes I call that a slow learner.
Fair.
And she was in the nursing job, worked in a hospital for the city of Colorado Springs. And after she had those near-death experiences, some of these people try to go back to their old job, their old life, and it just does not work out. They come back with so many psychic skills and abilities that's really what they should be doing, is using those to serve us. So after the 3rd near-death experience, she finally gave in to spirit and said, okay, I'll get back to doing the job I should be doing here, which is serving others, serving humanity, which is really a blessed, awesome calling and job. Even though our face doesn't get on the cover of Time magazine, it's still, in heaven, it is the most awesome job we can have. So that's Lori Neal. Our other speaker is Susan Nowicki. She died at the age of 20 while giving birth to a son. And while she bled out on the table, she went to the other side. And while on the other side, she was met by a man, and together they went off and had very interesting conversations and reminders. And this is pretty common with a lot of near-death experiences. And then she said she was told it's not her time, that she had to return. And she was angry. She didn't want to return. And then the guilt set in, because she had an infant son that she'd just given birth to, but she didn't want to come back here. But she did come back, and her life changed, of course, as all NDEs' life changed. And from one profession to another, she now works in hospice. She helps those with Parkinson's disease, dementia, and those who are having a hard time with their health issues. And this is a typical reorientation to a new job, a new career path. Many NDEs go into ministry, counseling, spiritual counseling, and helping others. All helping, all with love. So those are our two speakers, and each one of them will have 15 minutes to give their story. And then after that, we'll have a question and answer where we'll pass around the microphone, and you can ask your questions of them. So if you could please put your hands together and welcome Lori. She'll be speaking first 15 minutes, and then Susan. Okay.
Can I just use that one instead?
Oh, just use both of them. Just leave it
You
there.
think so?
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Feel all wired up. Okay. Now watch, I'll walk too far away from that and drag it away, but okay. My name is Lori Neal, as she said. I did have 3 near-death experiences. 2 of them were a situation where I really just stayed in the hospital setting. But it was the second one, when I was only 7 years old, that something stunning did happen. And it's interesting because when you have a near-death experience, even if you're only dead for a few minutes, in Earth time is what I like to call it, it doesn't mean that, that when you're having that experience on the other side that it's only a few minutes. Because the first thing I did when I woke up, I just want to take this one off, I really do. Hang on, I'm just going to do that real quick.
Hold on, I don't know if the camera can pick you up.
It will. Yeah. Will it work even if I don't have that on? 'Cause oh,
Yeah,
well.
if you
Okay.
could, yeah, if you could keep it on, because may as well.
There we go. Now it's closer to underneath me. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. One of the things, like JJ said, is that a lot of us that have near-death experiences, and like she said about Susan, we often end up going into what I call the healing fields or the helping fields. I was 5 years old when I went for a surgery and I was overdosed on Demerol and Valium. And this is a big reason that I became a nurse, because the nurse forgot to chart it up on the floor. I got to the OR and the OR nurse said, oh, she hasn't had her Demerol and Valium yet, and she gave me 2 more shots. So being only 5 years old, as soon as they put me under the anesthesia, I was out of body. And there was a TV show, this is in 1970 that this happened. So there was a TV show called Emergency, and it was about 2 paramedics. And that's what taught me what a flat line on an EKG screen meant. And it was kind of bothering me, the buzzer that flat line was making. And once I realized that was happening and how excited the medical personnel were, I started to realize, you know what, I think I'm out of my body. And then I realized that nurse had given me the 2 extra shots. And as soon as I thought about that, I thought, you know what, my mom is going to be so mad at these people. And the minute I thought about my mom, I was in the waiting room, hovering next to her. And I did perceive that I had a body until I kept trying to touch her. You know, I kept trying to touch her shoulder, and I realized my hand was going through it. And while I stood there trying to ponder how I could talk to my mom about what was happening, they did go ahead and use the paddles, and they brought me back. 2 weeks later, they went ahead and did another surgery and found out that it was an ear surgery, and I am deaf in my right ear. And a lot of us who end up doing this work are deaf in that right ear, because that's the side that we listen to spirit, and then this ear is what I listen to, the physical. So there was nothing they could do about my deafness, and I couldn't believe my parents trusted those people again. But the second time I had a near-death experience was much more intense. I was 7 years old. It was 2 months before I turned 8. And I had gotten hepatitis from a blood transfusion after a bad kidney biopsy. And in that case, I immediately went through the tunnel that often ends up sort of developing for us once we're out of body and we're thinking about what we're going to do next or what we should do. As soon as you have that thought, the tunnel opens up. And in my case, I went ahead and went through that tunnel, and when I got out, I was being raised a Southern Baptist. So I looked at this guy that walked up to me and I said, well, you must be Jesus. And I thought, he doesn't look like what our typical depiction of Jesus is. And he was very entertained at that assumption, and he had really bright blue eyes, and he had on the burlap rope for a belt. You know, just looked like he stepped right out of my children's Bible. And it turns out that it was St. Francis. But the Baptists don't talk about St. Francis very much. And he said to me, he said, I greet children and animals, right? He said, I greet children and animals who don't have anybody to greet them. And I said, well, why don't I have anybody to greet me? And he said, because, he said, do you know your grandma's mom? And I said, no, she died before I was born. And he said, exactly. And he said, that's what you usually do. You die before anybody can go before you. He said, if you had relatives from this lifetime that had died before you, then they would be here to greet you. But since you don't know any of the ones that have crossed over before you, it's me again. And he was acting a little bit, he was loving, but he seemed a little impatient. And he said something to the effect of, you do this every time. And I was like, I said, first of all, I don't think you understand that I died of hepatitis from a blood transfusion. Like, it's not my fault I'm here. And he said, your soul knows exactly why you're here. And I started to realize, you know what, it is your soul that gets to run what happens to you, and it is kind of the puppeteer for the puppet that your physical life is. And as soon as I started realizing that and taking responsibility for that, he went ahead and waved his arm, and we're outside in like a gorgeous mountain setting outdoors. There's mountains, there's pine trees, you know, it was just a beautiful outdoor setting. And he said, come on over here, and we're going to sit down on a rock, and we're going to talk about this. I was like, all right. So we went and we sat down on this rock, and he said, you know, if you don't live long enough in a physical lifetime, you're never going to learn the lessons that souls go to the physical to learn. And I was still kind of like, so what? But when he showed me the other people that I had been, or first he waves his arm, and I see about 3 adults and a lot of toddlers. And he said, do you recognize these people? And I said, I do. And the more I looked at each of them individually, I realized I knew all about those individuals. And it started to dawn on me that those were my past lives. And he said, look at all the children. And I was just like, yeah, that's sad. You know, they all died as children. And he said, right. He said, your soul likes to escape as soon as it can. You really struggle with the physical. And he said, and you know, in this time, you're actually very lucky. You know, I had had situations in my past lives, and you know, of course, in early time, it was much harder to be a kid. You know, I mean, the bubonic plague in England took me out at 2 months. There were all kinds of, it was just really interesting that you could see all those people. But there was a young French girl who was about 19. There was a Native American man who I thought was in his 80s. St. Francis said he happened to be 52 when he died. He was a great, he was a Plains Indian. But he said, really, you never make it to adulthood. He said 3 times out of, I don't know, 15. He's like, that's just not, that's not cutting it. He said, in this lifetime, you have good parents who love you. My father, in that year, in fact, in 1972, my dad was in California at a wrestling camp. He was the United States wrestling coach for the Olympics in 1980 and 1976, and he was on the 3 teams previous to that. So I was an Air Force brat. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I had it good. And he's like, you know, I really think you should rethink this and you should consider going back. And I'm like, well, I would, but the problem is that my liver shut down and I came up here to see you. And since I'm here, because the Baptist had taught me about the fiery pits of hell, I thought I really want to cut my losses and stay here where you guys are. And he's just like, well, let me tell you. He said, there's only one place to go when you die. And he said, you're here. And I was just like, well, what about Hitler? And he said, well, there's such a thing as reincarnation. And I'm like, wait, I'm Baptist. We do not believe in reincarnation. And he's like, were those your past lives? Like, well, yeah. But my mom and dad said that there's no such thing as reincarnation. And he's just like, well, I was Catholic once, and we didn't think so either. But that's not changing the fact. And I was like, okay. And he said, you know, another thing that we need is we need messengers on the other side. We need somebody who can give messages to the people over there in the physical when they are hurting or when something's happening. And he basically told me, he said, you're going to grow up to become a nurse. And even though I was only, you know, almost 8 years old, I had wanted to be a nurse since I was about 4. So I knew I wanted to be a nurse. So that was okay. That resonated with me. I did become a nurse at the age of 18 and 4 months. I started nursing school as a senior in high school. My high school had a vocational program. So what I did in my nursing career was oftentimes, you know, like JJ said, we have one foot in this world and one foot in the other world. And what we call it when we're bringing a message in from the other side is we call it channeling. And so sometimes in my nursing career, I would do what we call spontaneous channeling. And that means that when I put the blood pressure cuff on somebody, if they had something going on internally that their soul wanted to talk to them about, the next thing you know, I'm saying, so, about that fight with your husband this morning, you know, I think that's what's raising your blood pressure right now, so let's just give you a few minutes. And they're just like, how do you know that? You know, how do you know these things about me? And so that second near-death experience is truly when I got to have all the questions answered that I could possibly come up with, but again, I was only 7 years old. My third near-death experience, I had a ruptured ectopic pregnancy on Christmas Eve. I went to a little hospital and the ultrasound tech wasn't there because of the holiday. They called her in, but she needed to curl her hair and put her makeup on first. So it took her about 50 minutes to get to the hospital. In that time frame, I bled out, like Susan's story. And in that case, I just stayed in the hospital setting, and there was this beautiful angel with like long blonde hair and curly and, you know, the flowing robes that was in the room once I got out of body. And she was like filing her fingernails, and I thought that was really strange and looking almost bored. And I walked, you know, I kind of hovered up to her because she was in the corner of the room. And oftentimes, like if you had a near-death experience in here, you'd probably be in that corner. I don't know why, but it's always the corner of the building, and you're hovering above. And she's like, don't even look for the tunnel. She's like, you're not going to get the tunnel. I did have a son who was 11 months old. She's like, you need to stay and raise that child. And I'm just like, where's the tunnel? And you know, I thought she was really pretty, and it was kind of funny because it was years later that it dawned on me that that was actually my higher self. It was my soul in her perfection. She looked about 30 years old. I was 20, almost 21 when this experience happened. So it's kind of humorous that we often don't even recognize our own soul or our own, self when we're in our perfection. Because of course she was the exact size that I'd prefer to be if I could just stand in front of a mirror and mold everything, still looking like my genetics and my parents, but the best that I could be. And she said, you are just going to stay. She said, we're actually just doing this last near-death experience to solidify your communication with this side, because that's going to really start turning on when I get you back in there. And it did. And so eventually, it doesn't make sense in a nursing setting. They did not hire me to be an intuitive and a channel with my patients. My last job, as JJ said, was working with the city of Colorado Springs with police and firefighters when they were injured on the job. They can be a very black and white group, especially the police officers. And so they're they didn't know what to do with somebody who could just start telling them what was happening in their life, in their thoughts, where their stress on the job was coming from, and perhaps why they were getting injured on the job, because you got to be paying attention, in that kind of job. And certainly if they would get re-injured, then I would realize there's something going on up here that's making them not pay attention. And so, for example, a police officer comes in and it's like his third injury in about 5 months. And as I took his blood pressure, I said, if you weren't cheating on your wife, I think you'd be more present on the job. And I'm just like, I think maybe you should just have the integrity to go ahead and walk away from her and be with this woman that you want to be with. And he's just standing there looking at me like, what? And I said, does that not make any sense to you? I mean, I guess I wouldn't know that. The beauty about this work is that even when you shock somebody, if you're working for the light, which is what I call God, then it's going to resonate with them, and they're going to usually admit that you've come up with something that's true. So I do appreciate that about the work. It doesn't mean that it's still less startling or that you're invited to go in. And I've had other intuitives say to me, boundaries, don't jump over those boundaries. And it's like, I'm not really the one that decides to jump the boundary. Something just kind of automatically comes in. So how am I doing time-wise? Oh, we're getting close. About 4 minutes? Okay. Usually I make it such a long story that I was trying to make it quicker today, but something more about... Well, so the work that I do today is I did go ahead and leave my nursing career in 2011, and I have people, I'm a certified life coach for people who don't want to say that they're calling their psychic, and I don't love the name psychic because that makes people think that we're just like, picking up whatever you're thinking at that moment, and that we can just cross your boundaries. I'm only as good as whoever I'm getting my information from, and in my work, I speak to people's soul, and sometimes we'll call it their higher self. When somebody's physically alive, I like to call it their higher self. When they're in the soul state, meaning they don't have a physical incarnation, then that's when I call them soul. But really, it's the same thing. And our soul is the sum of every one that we've ever been or ever will be. And one thing I learned when I was in this near-death experience is that really when I kept looking at my physical body, it was just made of light. And if you combine all the lights of all of our souls, and everybody has one, whether they believe in it or not, when you combine that light with all the other lights, then you have the light. So God is really just the combination of all the souls in existence. And that's why all of us have a piece of light or God in us, no matter who it is. And in these very political times, it's kind of fun to keep reminding myself, they all have light. Everybody has light. And we're down here working on what I call this dichotomy. Sometimes people talk to me about dark side, and I do readings and consultations, and people will call me and say, I'm dealing with this really dark side stuff. And usually if that's happening, then somebody's just needing to learn a lesson about something, because the good news is that God, the light, is in charge of all of it. Whether it's, quote, dark side, the light, and that's only for contrast. Because if we've never been sad, do we know what it's like to be happy? So it's contrast in the human condition. But I will probably just stop there and let Susan talk, but I do look forward to answering your questions. Okay? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Susan. I was a scheduled C-section, but I went into labor before that date. When I got to the hospital, they noticed that it was coming pretty quick, so I was into surgery pretty fast. But everything went wrong, absolutely everything. Not only did they find that I was bleeding to death, but my son's cord was abnormally long and it was choking him. So what they did was they messed with my, from what I understand was told, they messed with my anesthesia. And somehow I don't know, but it put me in a place where things got dangerous and the bleeding apparently got worse from there. When they cut my son out, they were trying to save my son, which I said, you have to save my son. I had said, let me go. I made a choice and it was him. But my ex-husband was asked, who do you want to save when I started to bleed so heavy? And he said me, but please, try to save both. Well, I started to die. So, and my ex-husband was there. I was under, but my ex-husband was there. So he gave me the details afterwards, and then I talked to the doctor afterwards to find out what happened, because I knew something was wrong, because I ended up going somewhere else during the delivery. I was knocked out, and I came through this light. If there was a tunnel, which is what I hear from a lot of people, I don't recall the tunnel. I just remember getting to the end of the tunnel with this light that was the brightest thing I've ever seen in my life. It did not hurt my eyes, but it was the most loving light I've ever seen. It was welcoming. It was like a drug to go towards it. There was nothing I could do to control it. I wanted to go through it. I get through it, and there's this man there on a wagon, the kind you would think of from the 1800s. And I know it sounds odd, but that's what it was. He was over 6 feet tall. He had dark hair. It was wavy, cut to about here. He was in a white robe with the, rope thing. And I was surrounded. If anybody's seen that movie Always, where Hap, the character Hap, who is Richard Dreyfuss meets, that field of wheat, that was my field. But just remember that that movie was in 1989. My experience was 1983. So when that movie came and I saw that field, and I was like, oh my God, someone else must have had that, had popped up there, and maybe that's why they used it in the movie. But my gold, when I came into this place, were colors I'd never seen before. They don't exist here yet, or if ever, I don't know. The gold was so pure, not because it was worth all this money, but because it was, I don't want to just say special, but it's like it was holy. I don't know how to describe it. Every golden wheat plant was gold. I can't explain that. The sky was a blue I've never seen before. It was vibrant, and the white was pure. I mean, there is no way to describe that white. The whitest thing I could ever see anywhere doesn't come close to this white that I saw there. There's no comparison. And the colors were vibrant. I don't know how else to say it, and I've never seen them here. The other thing that I noticed when I got there, and this man, he told me his name was Gabe. And the love that I felt from this area, from Gabe, was so encompassing. It was like a drug. I've never felt it here on this earth, ever. That's with being the mother of 4 now and 2 grandchildren. It just doesn't compare. It's that powerful. It's that like a magnet. I can't explain it, but it's very powerful. You don't want to leave. You don't. So this man is telling me on the wagon, that wagon is going perpendicular for where I'm standing, and I am not aware of anybody. All I know is that I'm there. I